So, welcome everybody to the podcast, the AI Tsunami, hosted by myself, Nick Darvo, and David Beatty. A little bit of background about me. I was Google's chief evangelist for a number of years, working with some of the top companies in the world on their digital transformation. And now I am on a number of boards and I advise companies on AI. And I'm writing a book on my years at Google and everything I've learned about AI. And so we're super, super lucky to have Hans Peter Brondmo with us. Now, Hans Peter is a highly respected computer scientist and entrepreneur. He studied at the famous MIT Media Lab and at CERN, right, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. He invented, numerous important aspects of computer graphics in the 90s. He's worked at Nokia, Apple, Google. He was an entrepreneur, started numerous companies, many of which were sold successfully. He's written books on digital marketing and digital transformation. He's taught classes at MIT. And for the last 7 years, until recently, he was a CEO of Google's robotics company called Everyday Robots. And he recently wrote an article in Wired magazine about his team's 7-year quest to make autonomous robots a reality. I really, really encourage you to read it. It's a fascinating piece. And Hans Peter, welcome. And then I know you wanted to say a few things, and then we'll play a quick video.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And good morning, everyone. At least good morning from California. So look, I want to just kick this off real quick, and then we'll just launch into some conversation and sort of some series of topics that might be of interest. But what I wanted to start with is a little bit of context setting, so you can essentially understand where I'm coming from and the way I see the world. And so the starting point is, to ask a rhetorical questions, which is, if machines could do all or most of what we consider productive work and labor, then what would we do? And I've come to believe after running this robotics and AI moonshot at Google for 7 years, that if there was one thing I kind of came away with, it was that the robots are coming. Now, I'm not too worried about the overlords and coming in and sort of, taking over, but very much will change, and it'll change fast. Not as in tomorrow fast, but, over the next 5 years, I think we will see the first general purpose robots that can work in unstructured human environments, joining the workforce. And I think in the next 10 to 15, they'll become increasingly capable and ubiquitous. And so it's on the horizon. Again, it's not here tomorrow. And so this little video that I wanted to play for you is actually a little selection from a documentary that we made about this project, just to give you a sense of what's hard. And before you see it, I just want to also share something I'm a little bit passionate about, which is never trust a robot YouTube video. Basically, YouTube videos of robots are pretty much all fake, and they make things look really easy, and they make it look like robots can do backflips and everything else. And while they can, this is entirely programmed, meaning it's not much different than going to a Disney theme park, where you see, things jumping around and mechatronic sort of marvels doing interesting things. So the hard problem in robotics can only be solved with the use of AI, and the hard problem is understanding the world we live in. So let's cue the video, and then you'll basically start getting a sense of that, and we can come back to it and, of course, answer any questions you might have towards the end.
In many ways, we set out to do something impossible. We set out to build a machine that, without any human assist or control, would work alongside us and help us out in the real world. We have, as humans, this innate need to explore. We explore the depths of the oceans. We explore the tallest mountains. We explore space. That's partly who we are as people. We're exploring the frontier of how you bring a sense of intelligence and understanding and cooperation with people into a machine. How do you give a machine the level of intelligence and smarts necessary to make it able to work alongside us and help us out in our daily life? That's the stuff of science fiction.
The challenge is to say, we want robots that can perform usefully and safely in completely unstructured environments alongside people. That is the vision for everyday robots.
It's such a simple word, every day, but the type of challenges you encounter every day are there's just a myriad.
Everyday Robots was trying to do is unlike anything else in the industry.
Making a robot operate in human spaces is a really big deal. It changes from a thing that's very niche to a thing that can be literally everywhere.
For us, a moonshot meant to create something at a scale and level that had never been achieved before. And that was really to make the first multi-purpose, ubiquitous learning robot in everyday environments.
Already, even around this environment, as the robots live amongst us and work amongst us as a team, it's normal to have everyday robots part of our workplace, which is super strange, right?
There's going to be robots among us at some point, and we have to make sure that their actions are aligned with human intention.
The coolness about robots has always been that, computers are cool. Everyone sees them, they know how much you can do with them. And if you can take that computer brain and put it inside something that moves, whoa, what can you envision from there? A lot, right?
We are working on a problem that is fundamentally unsolved. So we have no working example for anyone really building a general purpose robot that does many different tasks in unstructured environments.
The best robots you could imagine 20, 30, 50 years ago tended to be machines that did what they did because we could actually program them to do what we wanted them to do. So it required us to know exactly what the task was, be able to describe it in a very clear, concise, almost stepwise routine and algorithmic way, and then have a robot replicate that.
Right now, there's a bunch of specialized robots that work in very constrained places where everything around the robot is designed for the robot. You can have a robot weld with perfect precision over and over and over again forever. But if you want to make a robot that can open a door in a house and have it work for several different doors in several different houses, that's still really, really hard for us.
The real world is really complex and messy and unpredictable. That's a big challenge for robotics because you can't tell them very specifically what to do. So you have to build a completely new system that can inherently deal with this messiness and complexity.
You can't program robots to live amongst us and help us. You have to teach them. How does it know what I know? How can it do what I do in the world I live in?
Machine learning is one of the few things that we have that really makes it possible to get computers to behave intelligently in unstructured environments by using experience, using data, using things that the computer's seen in the past to figure out patterns.
One example that people might be very familiar with is machine learning systems learning how to recognize what's in an image. So by showing it millions of images of different kinds of objects and telling it what each image is, it can now learn to recognize any image that you show it. You can extrapolate that and use that kind of same methodology for doing much more complex tasks. Like in the case of robotics, learning how to manipulate objects, learning how to grab something.
Each time the robot attempts to do a task, we can reward it if it succeeds, tell it that it didn't succeed if it fails, and then the things that lead it to succeed get rewarded more and more often, and it gets better and better at the task.
The technology is all here to make a machine that is in space, that moves around, that can interact with you, that can do useful things, like everything's just there. It's like the primordial soup, right? It's just something has to put it together into one coherent helper robot, and we're off.
Anyone can go sketch something. They can sketch the wackiest thing they possibly can think of. It's really hard, though, to take all the complexities that exist with the technology from software, hardware, all of the ambiguity of product market fit, figuring out how to thread that needle. This is actually something we could technically make that might be a business that we think people would actually want to be around. That's a more fun challenge.
General purpose robotics is hard. It's legit hard. But I can see how it's going to get to a point where it's a reality.
I like the term general purpose because I think it's like really staking a claim that is counter to how research is being done today. So someone might just focus on cameras, on perception, and someone might just focus on navigation, and they'll make one robot that can do one thing. There are really like robots out in research that can walk up the stairs and then do something when it gets to the top of the stairs. The whole machine is designed to do just that one portion of the task. We need to get good at doing a variety of things in a variety of environments, not just seeing and moving, but also manipulating these things. And that is a big job.
Things suck at the beginning. You make all kinds of mistakes.
Holy shit.
Every time you start something new, you're in a discovery process. If there aren't problems, then that means you're done. All right, well, we're not done. We just started.
We're making meaningful progress on some of those problems. We were having robots roam around in cafes here at Google, cleaning tables on their own, autonomously.
I'm so used to it that it doesn't seem crazy. But also, if I take one step back, I go, a robot just came on my desk and picked up all my dishes and went away. Like, this is so bizarre. You know, you're going and the robot would come up, interrupt your work and look at you and say, can I clean your desk? And then you have to decide, tell it to, you know, fuck off or let it clean your desk. And so sometimes, you know, depending on what you're working on, you're like, okay, fine, clean my desk. And you just back up and kind of watch it do its thing.
Yes. That's good.
Everyday robots is not optional. The world's population is shifting. And if we don't have labor, we're going to be in a world of hurt. Robotics and AI is essentially filling this giant void, and will increasingly be doing so because we have an aging population and we have a shrinking number of new young people entering the workforce. And those shifts are huge. There won't be people to take care of the elderly. There won't be people to do productive labor. Can we manage without robotics and AI? Yeah, but not at the level that we're used to living, and certainly not in a way that would bring other people up to the level of standard of living that we have.
Hey, Hans Peter, that was awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Wow.
And congratulations on everything your team was able to accomplish in 7 years. And so if people have questions, please put them in the chats. You know, I've got a number of questions, so I'll get started. And Professor Beatty is with us as well. If you've got some questions, David, Hans Peter will answer them. I'm going to start with, I think, one of the themes in your article as well as the video. This stuff is hard. Can you, in the article, you do an amazing job of explaining why it's so hard. The video explained it in part, but can you take us through why doing this was so difficult?
Yeah, so I think what is hard to understand, there's a concept, or it's called Moravoc's paradox, which is things that are easy for humans are hard for computers, and things that are hard for computers is easy for humans. So computers can add very big numbers very quickly. They can do complex, mathematical tasks and communicate, over large distances in nanoseconds. And so computers have these capabilities that, extend and expand on what we do. But I'm sitting here, at my desk, picking up my coffee from this morning. What I just did right there is really hard for a computer to do, or a robot. And the reason is it has to understand the world that I live in. It can't just, you look at, well, how does it understand? It looks at, what I'm looking at right now, and it sort of takes a picture, if you like, or a video. And then it needs to translate everything I see into something it can interact or do something with as a robot. And so, we spent years just reliably picking up cups off tables and learning how to do that. And the way we did that was using AI, using machine learning, and it specifically, machine learning that was trained on. So Google had access to very large training data sets from cell phones and from the internet, just lots of images. So we could initially at least look at this table and say, okay, I see a cup, I see a glass of water, a transparent glass of water. So I'm not sure exactly how to interpret that because I can see through it. So you start actually thinking about how would a computer interpret what I see just at the very top level. And then once it does that, then it's like, well, is that cup attached to the table? Is it a feature of the table, or is it loose, and can I manipulate it? Well, you and I don't even have to think about that, right? That's just we learn that as children, right? We play around, we push things, we move around, we play in the real world. And through play, we discover, and of course, we also have some probably, genetic and some biomechanical programming that allows us to sort of learn very quickly. That's what we needed to do with the robots. That's why I say you can't program them, you have to teach them. There's no way to program a robot to understand something as complex as this world. So you basically have to throw a huge amount of data at the robot and then help it through training, through practice, understand and learn how to do things like this. And that's, that's just picking a cup off a table.
Yeah, and on that one, I mean, I remember I Googled the demos that we saw and the videos that we saw. Can you explain a little bit more about the training, right? I mean, how much of it was physical, learning to play like a child would? What kind of rewards, you would give the computer when it was correct, and then how you then transform the training to something much more complex?
So what we realized early on was that there was no way we were going to build enough robots for them to understand the real world. And so we had to approach it in many different ways. We could take existing, as I mentioned, image models that have been trained on large amounts of internet and other data so that it can recognize and identify objects, for example, and then start labeling the world. So it knows that that's a door, it knows that that's a window, it knows that this is a computer screen, and it has that knowledge. But then to actually start doing something with that, for example, to predict the 3D position, the position in space of this cup. I didn't know I would get as much use out of this cup when I bought my coffee this morning. To understand that and to make it useful, we had to start training it. And what we did there was we spun up a simulator. And think of a simulator essentially as a giant video game. And if you're running around a video game, there's some sense of 3D, right? You can move through certain spaces, you bump into people, to objects, to walls, etc. So this simulator was similar, but instead of people running around and shooting each other in the simulator, in this case, it was robots running around trying to pick up cups or clean tables or do a series of tasks. And in doing so, we in the last year of the project, in 2022, we ran about 230 million robot instances in the cloud in the course of a year. So think of it as every night there were thousands and thousands of robots practicing, and they were practicing in the simulator. So they were doing something, and because it was a computer program, if the robot picked up the cup and tipped it over like you saw in that little simulation in the video, then the computer knows that, right? Because it's a computer world. So it could give the robot negative reinforcement. Don't do it that way. And if the robot is actually able to grasp the cup some way or other, it'll give it some positive reinforcement. So we would train up these models in the simulator. Now, then we had something called sim to real. Like, how do you bring that simulated model from simulated data into a real robot? And I like to just simplify it by thinking of it as the robot was dreaming all night. And then it woke up in the morning and it had a new model that it had to embody in the physical robot. And it's kind of like it wakes up, it's a little, it's a little janky in the beginning. And then it needs to move into the real world, looking similar to the world that had been simulated for it, and practice a little bit and improve the model through practice. So we had robots, we used to call it the robot playpen. We had robots, maybe like 20, 30 of them in this playpen doing certain tasks. And then they would take the models in the morning when they came down from the cloud and try to embody them in the real world. And then that feedback would go back into the model, go back into the cloud the next night, and we'd have another hundreds of thousand robots practicing that task again. So simulation became a very important part to generate synthetic data, or with synthetic simulations, generated data that could then be applied to the real world robot.
And presumably that simulation work, the impact of that was that orders of magnitude more than the physical simulation? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we built the robots you saw, or the last generation of the robots you saw in this little video clip. We built 200 of them, and we had a subset of those in 5 Google buildings, doing things like wiping tables, inspecting on office buildings and conference rooms, sorting trash, and a number of other tasks.
There's a question from Nicole, which is super interesting. Like you mentioned, I think partly in jest that robots were sleeping and then waking up in the morning to learn something new. Can robots go 24 hours a day, or do they need a little time to reset and rethink to reach peak performance? Like how do you think about that?
They can go 24/7 as long as they've got fresh batteries. But we were at a point where we would have so the robots were fully autonomous. They did what they did without any human supervision. And if you recall from the video again, the one where the robot is like a woman is walking past it and it reaches over and almost falls over and she drops her sandwich and stabilizes the robot. So we had people in buildings where there were humans, which were pretty much all of them. We had people who were basically walking along and cataloging the robot's behavior, including its mistakes, so that could be fed back in and we could learn from those mistakes. And also for safety reasons, they had a big red button, and if the robot decided to do something that wasn't sanctioned, we just hit the red button and it would.
So after 7 years, and by the way, congratulations on all that hard work. After 7 years of hard work, what could the robot do really well, and what couldn't it do?
Can I ask a question related to that, Nick?
Yeah, go for it.
Hans Peter, every time you phoned your mother, she asked you, when am I getting my robot? Sadly, she never did. But is it possible to conceive that you could have built and delivered a robot that knew her living room, her kitchen, her bathroom, and her, not the whole world, but her environment? Is that not a possibility that's a lot easier than trying to build a general purpose everyday robot for everything?
So, I mean, possible is a difficult one to pin down here. So if we put it on a longer time scale, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that motivated me and what you're referring to with my mother was my mother, towards the end of her life, had advanced stage Parkinson's and suffered from a few other ailments. She lived, I'm originally Norwegian, she lived in Oslo, and because of the Norwegian healthcare system, she had 3 people showing up at her apartment every day, 1 in the morning, 1 midday, and 1 in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. Whenever we would speak, my mother I would call her on the weekends, and she wouldn't even say hello. She would just say, "When are the robots coming?"
Yeah.
And I would tell her it'll be a while, Mom, but they are coming, and sadly they didn't get there in time to help her. But she lived in a nice apartment in downtown Oslo. It had an elevator as opposed to stairs, and so that was helpful for if a robot was to go there. But what you need to do is you need to solve some general problems. It was mentioned, cleaning up a table, opening a door, navigating through what the robot would perceive as a cluttered space, right? Anything with obstacles is cluttered for a robot. The reason it's easy in warehouses is you literally draw lines on the floor, and the robot just follows these lines, and they can move things around. They're basically like automated forklifts or little transport systems. That's very different than sticking a robot in my mother's apartment in Oslo. So yes, eventually when that robot shows up in her apartment or in an apartment like that, or let's say I think the first entry into that general domain will probably be assisted living facilities, where it's a little more like, it's ADA compliant. So you can, American with Disabilities Act compliance. So you can have, you can have wheels as opposed to legs, which makes the robot a lot safer and easier to initially deploy. And so the thing is, the opening a door, picking up a cup, these fundamental understanding of space, that this is open space and I can move through it. This is a table. The table doesn't move, but the chairs can move a little bit and I can straighten it up. Understanding that a carpet, in my mother's case, she shuffled her feet. If a carpet is flipped over, she could fall and injure herself. So the robot might see this and straighten out the carpet. If my mother lost something on the floor, it'd be very frustrating for her, and a dignity thing, which is she wasn't able to pick up what she lost, and she would wait until somebody showed up 3 hours later to help her pick a book off the floor. These are small things, but huge for an aging person wanting to live independently and with dignity. So in these situations, the robot would if we were to hypothesize how this might work in the future, the robot would come in, it would have some basic understanding of all spaces, meaning any space, but then it would particularly learn this space. So it would basically roam around for a day or two, basically familiarize itself with the whole space. It might look at your bookshelf and quickly, just with a couple of glances, categorize the whole bookshelf. So when you say, hey, that book written by so-and-so, can you go fetch that? And the robot would have instant access to where the book is and just go fetch it off the bookshelf, right? So it would catalog and understand the space. It would understand what a book is. It would understand how it might pull a book off a bookshelf. These might be generic, general capabilities. But then in terms of the specifics, it would have to get to know my mother's apartment.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, kind of going back to my question, right? So after 7 years, the list of tasks you just outlined to just help, in one room is super complex. What could the robot do at the end, and what could it not do? What was the hardest thing that you were trying to teach it, and what was something it was able to accomplish pretty readily?
What was happening was the technology evolution, and we've all seen it now with LLMs and Gemini and ChatGPT and Claude and all the big language models and the multimodal models. The technology development was very rapid. We were using the same technology. We were using transformers, which is the foundation for LLMs, 2-3 years before ChatGPT came out for various parts of the robot tasks. So we were observing how quickly the robot was able to conquer new territory, new terrain. And as I mentioned earlier, bringing a robot into the real world is really, as the woman in the video says, legit hard. It is really difficult because of the complexity. So what were they doing? We had robots deployed in Google cafes, cleaning tables after meal service. This was a task that, there might be 80 tables in a cafe, and it's a very boring task. The people who worked there would generally not like doing it. And what the robot would do is it would literally just very methodically and slowly move around, wipe down the table, and then inspect it. And if it saw something, say a ketchup stain that it couldn't actually get up, then it would just mark that and it would move on. And at the end, it would have cleaned 73 out of 87 tables, where the remainders, either it couldn't reach something or there was something in, it was blocked. And so people would actually at that point only have to go and clean up the remaining, I don't know my math here, but 12 tables. And so I think you're not going to see robots coming in and just like taking over. You're going to see them assisting in the first generation in a way where if I can reduce the need for boring rote human tasks by 80%, at the scale of a corporation like Google, that translates into a lot of person hours saved. And so I think what you'll see is you'll see, and those people, by the way, could then focus on what they really should be doing as cafes, which is interacting with the customers and doing more complicated and more, sort of human complex tasks. So that was one example. Another example was Google had a problem that we identified, which was, those bins you have in every office where there's a yellow one, a green one, and a blue one, and a black one or something, right? and you're trying to figure out where your wrapper from your kind bar goes. And like you stand there for 2 seconds and shit, I just drop it in one of them. And it turns out for recycled plastic, there are, I forget the number, but it's more than 10 different types of recyclable plastic. So you just get a plastic thing and you drop it in one of maybe the blue one. Well, this turned out to be a problem because if the contamination rates were over 5% in these bins, everything would go to landfill. So we said, well, why can't the robots just roam around and like look in the bins and sort stuff? But how do we teach a robot to sort? So this was a big example of where we used the simulator. We have the robots learning how to sort in a simulation and then coming to the bins and essentially getting better with practice. So they would pick up something, they would look at it, they would look in the bin, they would look at something and says, I think that's in the wrong bin. They'd pick it up. Here again, we go back to my cup. I think this one's compostable. They would pick it up. They would over time learn that this was a compostable cup, something I might or might not know, and drop it in the compost. And then as opposed to recycling. And then they would take something in recycling or in compost and drop it in trash because it shouldn't be there. And we were able to get the contamination rates down below acceptable levels so that everything could go to the appropriate place. And again, at the scale of a company with hundreds of thousands of employees, that turns out to be tons of trash and a small contribution to a big problem. So these were the kinds of things, and this was the same robot. So the same robot that wiped the table and inspected air quality in conference rooms and opened doors and went in there and cataloged the conference room. And so if the whiteboard needed to be cleaned, it couldn't do it on its own yet, although it was practicing. But it would just say, oh, this conference room needs some help. And then the janitorial staff would come and fix up the conference room. So these kinds of things were lowering it was sort of information gathering and improving on tasks that normally would go unaddressed or humans initially, would just not want to do.
Yeah, fascinating. You started your remarks with, the robots are coming, which is a great way to start, a podcast. Take us through, 5, 10, 15 years. What can these robots do? And there's also a question from the audience about, the robots doing nefarious things and how much, we should be concerned about that.
Yeah. Well, my crystal ball is imperfect for sure. And so I don't have a sort of a strong opinion on exactly when things will happen, but it will, and there's just no question in my mind. And I do think that, robotics will have its ChatGPT moment at some point where you'll just see them do something kind of remarkable. And I think, if you look a little under the hood, that's already happening in some areas. I have a relatively strong opinion on morphology, like what should the robot look like? And I think that the robots that are taking on human form, we call them humanoid robots, I think is generally, there are use cases where that is important and necessary. But in many cases, I think it's actually a waste of resources because the hardest problems are back to understanding the world, not putting legs on a robot. And so while that is a mechatronic marvel, and you've seen the Boston Dynamics videos where they do flips and et cetera, this is very impressive technology, but it's not the primary problem you need to solve for a robot to be helpful and useful in the real world. And it does mean if it doesn't have legs, it does mean it can't walk upstairs. And so if it can't walk upstairs, there's certain places where it's not going to go. Well, maybe there's an elevator. We taught our robots to ride the elevator. I mean, sorry, not elevator. Yeah, the elevator. So you could go, press the button, wait for the elevator, go into the elevator, sit and wait until it went to the right floor. And eventually you could just have it talk over Wi-Fi to the elevator. So it didn't have to push the button. It could just say, come here, pick me up, drive me up, and then, off I go. So we don't have to think exactly the way humans think, right? We could solve problems in different ways. So I think you will see the first, as I was saying in my initial remarks, I think we'll see the first generation of robots in unstructured human spaces within the next 5 years. There's a lot of money going into the space right now. And I think that we'll start seeing emergent, probably fairly narrow use cases. But there will be more general robots that can navigate safely among people. That was another thing we had completely addressed. I have some very cool videos where two people are standing talking to each other and the robot just barrels right past them between them, and they kind of stand there, and again, as one of my colleagues in the video said, it's normal and it's strange, but they would just sort of laugh and chuckle and the robot would take off but so they were very safe to be around in this environment. And once people got used to them, it was like nobody even noticed. The robots were just there moving around. So this stuff, the technology components are there. Now, in terms of nefarious uses, we made it clear that we were not wanting, obviously, we didn't look at anything that weaponized the robots, that made them, and we didn't work with in our case, with defense and military applications. We had more than enough to do just, trying to get the robots to pick a cup off the table. So I think, but will you see robots used in a variety of different places? And by robots, I also can generalize that. Robots can fly, robots can swim, robots can, there's lots of things robots could potentially do with different morphological, designs and principles than what we had focused on. So will there be robots that can be harmful? Yes. And I think that's a question then ultimately of, do we allow a human in the loop for any decision that could be harm people? And that I'm pretty adamant that we can't, whether it's robots or AI in general, we really can't take humans out of the loop in some of these key decisions. It's no different in my mind. An AI working at a trading desk, I think comparably, robots trading or AIs trading without any human interaction or intervention, what could possibly go wrong, right? So we need to figure out how to get where to interject human guardrails and human checks into these systems. And that's a complex human problem, not really a robot or technology problem. That's a challenge for regulators and for, international treaties and contracts, right? Which I think we need in this space.
As part of the Wired article, you say jokingly that Larry Page told you needed 17 engineers to build, this robot. In the end, you ended up building a team that was, talented. It had multiple disciplines. How much did diversity play in terms of a role, like having different genders and different people from different parts of the world? Like how important was that to make sure the robot was really representative?
Yeah, Larry, I mean, I have a ton of respect for Larry. He's one of the smartest people I've encountered, and he wasn't always easy to understand. He would kind of speak in tongues at times, and at least that's how we all interpreted it. And I remember having this conversation with him where he basically said, it was like, all you need is 17 machine learning people. And I was confused, right? Why 17? Why not 11 or 14 or 21? And I was like, and how do we build the actual robot with 7 machine learning people? But the point he was making was really that there are some very hard problems, which is essentially AI problems. As I've indicated already, understanding the world, being able to, in a general way, interact with the world, have enough understanding that you can engage and interact with the physical world. And this is really an ML problem. And if we don't solve that problem, all the other stuff is moot, right? So I think what he was saying was just, invest in the hard problems. And then, but it's also very hard to build a robot. And so I didn't exactly fire everybody and say, well, let's keep you ML people over here in the corner. We had to build a robot also, but it was an important provocation because he was really just emphasizing where the hard problem was. Sorry, what was the second part?
Yeah, the second part was in terms of diversity. How important was it to have gender, diversities of all types to make sure the robot was representative? This is a question from the audience, a great question.
Yeah, I show up at this thing in 2016, early 2016, January, and it was sort of the remnants of 9 robot companies that Andy Rubin and Larry Page had acquired, Google had acquired, and I spent a few weeks trying to understand which way is up and who these people were, and we didn't really have a mission yet. We just had all these cool technologists and cool technology. And so part of my role was to help figure out how to turn that into something. And so I gather for a few weeks, I've kind of noticed who the opinionated thinkers and the smart, quiet thinkers and who the people were who I could sort of tap for more information. And so I gathered them all in a room, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks in, so call it February 1st of 2016. And we're sitting around and I'm asking them a series of questions and we're going through a series of exercises that I'm leading them through exercises. And in about 30 minutes in, I call a timeout and I said, does anybody in this room notice something that's a little off? And the first guy says, yeah, the lighting's kind of bad. And yeah, I said, that's not exactly what I was looking for. And to his credit, the second person said, there are no women in the room. And this was, here we were building robots that are going to live amongst us one day and eventually in our homes. And there wasn't a single woman in sort of the gathered in that room. Maybe my mistake, I haven't found any, but I made it very clear that diversity is of significant importance as these things are going to come, as we're going to think about them living amongst us. And as you saw in the video, that there were probably as many women in that video speaking as there were men. And so I made a very concerted effort to focus initially on gender because we were a smallish team and you can only really focus on one thing at a time. The research I'd read and the experiences I had is if you can get to about 33% gender pair, like with women in a room, then or in an organization, then it starts stabilizing and sort of solving itself. But until then, it has to be a top-led strategic effort. And so I was able to get there after 7 years. I had my leadership team was 50% women, and the organization at large was around 30% at the end. But it took a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of convincing, and especially given the fact that we were never compromising, of course, on quality. So the only excuse I would give my team for not hiring faster was that they hadn't seen enough gender diverse or in general diverse candidates, qualified candidates in the pipeline. If at the end of the day they could show that they'd interviewed a sample set and chose a white dude and he was the best qualified for the job, great. But I wanted to see the pipeline. I wanted to see that they'd actually so we tracked that. And guess what? When we started like really just making that a requirement, everybody understood they had to do it. Suddenly the numbers started going up, right? Slowly, but they went up. So very important to have different, and cognitive diversity as well, right? Life experience diversity. Gender was just and sort of an easy thing to focus on in the sense that not easy to do, but easy to focus on. But we really wanted a lot of cognitive diversity as well, people who had different perspectives. And something like this, we invented something that didn't exist. We were trying to invent something that doesn't exist. And so you need a lot of perspectives. The other thing we did, which I'll just quickly mention, which I'm very excited about and very proud of, is we started something that we ended up calling Impact Lab. And Impact Lab was essentially the place that I would send all the interesting people I found that didn't really fit into the organization. And the woman on my leadership team, Denise, she ran it. And so Impact Lab we had an advisor who used to run was the former president of SEIU, the second largest labor union in the United States. We had an artist in residence, a former dancer, a ballet dancer in New York, who was getting a PhD in robotics. And we had a philosopher who was helping us think about what it means to be human in an age of intelligent machines. And this program, Impact Lab, we had lecture series, we convenings and internal conversations where we would bring labor rights activists in, and we would bring people into the process of making and thinking about the effect of all this work on the world we lived in. And guess what? It was obviously great, and we learned a lot, but the employees loved it because they were smart. They are smart people, right? They're sitting there saying, oh my God, if this thing starts working, my dad has a job like this, it could impact his work. They're all humans. They're all sitting there looking at the stuff they're creating. And this gave everybody a place and a vehicle for having conversations. And they weren't out in the public, right? We didn't sort of get up on some stage and have the conversation. And because we could have them internally, people weren't fighting and throwing tomatoes at each other. They were having real, curious, engaged dialogue. And this was super exciting and I think worked really well. And we got a lot of, and they weren't actively involved in designing the product so much, maybe with the exception of Katie Kwan, the dancer and roboticist who got very involved in essentially designing AI models for multiple robots, behaving together in flocks, and it was kind of these performances she created that were beautiful. Great TED Talk, by the way, if anybody's interested, you should Google just last April, Google her TED Talk, and you'll learn about sort of some of the work we did there and see some more cool videos.
That's awesome. There's a nice comment from Nicole about just how fantastic that you're bringing more women into technology leadership. Probably have time for one more question or maybe two, but look, you've been around innovative companies your entire career, right? You've also worked at companies like Nokia that, ended up struggling because of disruption. Like, what is it in the ethos of an innovative company? Like, what is it that creates that innovation, that risk taking? What is special in your career that you've seen that we have CEOs on the call, we have board members. What are the three things that companies should take from what you've done in your career to make themselves more adaptable, and more forward-looking?
Yeah, if I had simple answers to those questions, it would be great. They're great questions and very important questions. They're just hard to pin down. I think what I've maybe experienced and learned over the years is, I think most important, it has to come top down. I think if you got a very operations focused CEO and leadership team, which might work very well for the business he or she is running, and and then somebody comes into the business sort of further down the rank and file and wants to do some crazy project without clear definition early on. A lot of innovation happens out of sort of a primordial soup of sorts. It happens out of chaos and out of confusion and out of maybe a vision and an idea, at least if you're trying to do disruptive innovation. So there's also sort of a difference between, what I'll call kind of Apple style innovation, which is incremental innovation on something that's a known formulaic output, an iPhone, versus sort of disruptive innovation, such as self-driving cars or robots that can live amongst us one day. And so if you're doing the former, I think it's maybe it can be systematized a little bit better because you kind of have a roadmap. But if you're doing the latter, if you want to actually be, which is sort of the world I've lived in most of my career, if you're doing the latter, then you're essentially fighting against the organization. The DNA in the organization is going to try to squash you because it's a resource game, right? And they want more resources. And the argument will almost always be, if you gave me $5 million, I'd put that into selling more product and we'd be, bigger and grow faster and be more profitable. You're giving it to this doofus Norwegian guy over here and he's making robots. What the hell is that about? So therefore, if it doesn't come from the very top and you don't have, a very strong sponsorship and a willingness to kind of protect and isolate, I think it's really hard. And even in a place like Google, I think when the founders were still around, this was very much a part of the ethos. They liked that chaos of people running around and doing things. As the organization scaled and grew, it became more difficult to manage all that, right? Because part of the culture was just allowing for that. The whole idea, for example, of 20%ers, right? Where any employee could spend 20% of their time working on kind of any crazy project they wanted to. When you multiply that by, again, a few 100,000 employees, that's suddenly a pretty big cost across the organization and can get somewhat chaotic in terms of where people's focus is. So it's hard to scale. But Google X, which was where, Everyday Robots was born and lived for its first 5 years, Google X was really intended. It was set aside a little bit from the main campus. It was its own place. It had its own culture, its own way of thinking. And it was an attempt at creating an environment that welcomed the uncertainty and the chaos and the craziness of these types of projects, and a willingness also to shut things down and realize that they weren't working, etc.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting because John Thompson and Lou Gerstner in the mid-90s, Hans Peter, had the same problem with IBM. It was going bankrupt. And John went out around the world as the vice chairman of the board and talked to, more people and visited more plants and saw more customers than anybody in the history before he came back. He said, Lou, I've just done all of this work globally. We're perfect at one thing. And he smiled broadly, hoping this was going to be the answer. And John said, we're perfect as a company at crushing all new ideas. And it's precisely the bureaucratization had stifled, completely annihilated the innovative capacity of the organization. So he did exactly what you suggested. He just severed. He said, Lou, give me $200 million. I'll pick 12 projects. I don't want HR anywhere near me. I don't want finance anywhere near me. I'll report to you, and I'll build you 5 new billion-dollar businesses in the next 5 years, which happily he did. But it was by cutting off completely the innovative need from the ongoing bureaucracy of the core businesses. And I think that Nick and I have looked through with the Stanford profs, and we found that 90 of the Fortune 500 now have incubators, which are, I think, sort of capture this need to trade off the bureaucratic needs of the core from the innovative requirements of the future.
Yeah, and I think there's one quick remark on that. I think there are two approaches, right? Incubators, which I think have a sort of a, you know, it's difficult to get those to work as well, right? But the other alternative is you just go buy little companies when they're, or you let.
That's right. But you keep them completely separate from you. Yeah. We did that with Colliers, and I was on the board there, and we have an international commercial real estate brokerage business. We bought 50% of somebody trying to disrupt that business, put them next door. They're not part of us at all, but they're just across the street. So if you want to go and see how you're going to get killed tomorrow morning, you just walk across the street.
Exactly. Well, we're gonna. I just want to thank you, Hans Peter, for an amazing, super interesting webcast. Really, really appreciate it. Really appreciate your time. Again, this will be viewed, recorded by a lot of people. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And then Quinn, please take us away.
Wait a minute. I want to know where we go looking. Hans Peter, where do we find our everyday robot now? Where do I go?
So Everyday Robots was Google decided to discontinue the program in 2023, early 2023, for overall cost reasons at the time, given where the economy was at. So they will come, exactly where they'll come from, or where your everyday robot will come from is still TBD.
Hans Peter, thank you very much for participating today. Are there any thought leaders or newsletters to follow related to robotics that you would recommend?
Off the top of my head, I could probably list about, I would go to Substack and I would go to the usual places and just look, but but I wouldn't say off the top of my head that any one in particular comes to mind. So I cannot recall anyone.
Well, it was a great snapshot today. Really appreciated it. Beautiful. On behalf of all the attendees. For anyone else still hanging on, our next event is November 15th. The AI Tsunami is a partnership with David Beatty and Nicholas Darvo-Garneau. And on November 15th, we'll be hosting John Stokes, one of the first AI VC investors based in Montreal, Canada. John is going to be talking about, they've founded some storied AI startups, including Element AI with Yoshua Bengio, who's considered one of the godfathers of AI, along with Jeffrey Hinton. And John Stokes has said that directors and leaders must be prepared. He's been a part of countless technology waves, and he thinks AI is such a powerful new technology that its intro will be one of the most consequential versions of this innovative technology cycle he has witnessed. So please come and attend on November 15th, and then there will be one more in early December before we wrap the series up. Thanks a lot, David, and thanks to the audience.
Thanks, Quinn. Thanks, everybody. See you next time around.